Oh, there we go. Okay.
Well, it says we're live, but nobody's here yet, so I think it's still just us.
No, there's people on comments.
Oh, all right. Livermore Falls, Maine. Hey,
Yeah.
that's where Livermore Falls is. Actually, it's Livermore is where the Washburns are from.
Oh,
In Israel and all that. Yeah, that's a cool. It's so pretty.
Kirk wants people to not type so loud. I'm with Kirk.
Oh, but I'm going to push back on that because little known fact, I actually had a bad accident and have lost a lot of the use in my right hand for a number of years now. So I can't hold a pen and I type everything because that's much easier. And oh my God, people get so angry with me. I'm like, stop typing. It's like, I can't, I'm, it's not that I'm being rude to the lecturer. I literally can't take notes. So,
yes. Wow.
so I'm that person everybody complains about.
I think Kirk said he had a headache, and that's justifiable, not people who want you to stop typing.
Oh, that works. That works. All right. Hi, everybody. Joanne and I rolled out this morning.
Pretty literally, actually.
That's right. That's right. Just because we wanted to say hi and talk to each other, basically, I think. But we were saying before we went live that in many ways the stuff that feels new this week is harder to talk about, the attacks on the ships in the Caribbean, for example. And there's not, to my mind, a huge amount new in the news about the murder of Charlie Kirk, which is seemingly everywhere, except for the fact that the administration is using it as an excuse to try and silence all opposition. Which is with a really broad brush and mischaracterizing an awful lot of what is out there, including, I think, what Jimmy Kimmel said, to try and gain control of the entire political narrative. And so we were talking about that, and Joanne, in her infinite wisdom, was like, oh yeah, that's like, and I was really fascinated.
Okay, that's like precisely what happened, and come with me here, folks, because I promise you it's true, in the late 1790s, when the Federalists, Hamilton and his particular friends, as they were known, had the presidency. John Adams was president, had control of Congress, got into a quasi-war with France, and seized the moment to try and clamp down on their opposition, silence their opposition, find ways to do things to sort of push them into a zone where they would be boxed in and couldn't get out of, and they would seem unpatriotic, and did this while they were in power, thinking that then they could claim power forever and use it to destroy their opponents. And in particular, what grabbed at me this week and what led me to that was the whole Jimmy Kimmel episode and about silencing criticism. One of the things that the Federalists did in the late 1790s, when they thought they were ahead and they were going to use their moment to silence the opposition, was the Sedition Act. So the Sedition Act essentially made it a crime to criticize the president or the government. The logic of the Federalists was, well, we're in a time of, it wasn't actually a real war. It was an almost war with France, known as the Quasi-war, which somehow always makes me want to laugh. But it was the Quasi-war with France. And so what the Federalists said is, well, the government is so weak at this point. It's only a couple of years old. So people shouldn't be able to criticize the government because that will take away the authority of the government, and the government doesn't have a lot of authority. So this is a matter of national security. This is a matter that goes far beyond us. Then what they said privately to each other was, we can actually crush the opposition. We can use the Sedition Act to attack Jeffersonian Republican newspapers, which is what they did. And they brought charges against 4 of the 5 biggest newspaper editors, 4 of the 5 Republican newspapers, the biggest, using the Sedition Act. So there was a moment in which people in power thought that they would grab it while they had it, make sure that they would stick around forever. They were actually very distrustful of democracy, and the nation was kind of drifting in a more democratic direction. So the Federalists were like, okay, this is excellent. We're going to give the president power to deport dangerous foreign nationals. That's the Alien Acts
that Trump evoked, the 1798 Foreign Alien Act.
Well, that made
Alien Enemies Act.
It made my brain want to explode. That he was like, yeah, I'm using that. It was like, That was the repressive Federalist.
Which has been the courts have thrown that out as illegal, by the way. Can I ask you a whole bunch of questions though?
Yeah, yes, that makes me scared.
Is
Yes.
this is just so you know, everybody, it's really cool to get to talk to really smart people and get to ask them questions, which I love to do.
Assuming they can answer, but yes.
Well, it's not, as you know, it's no shame if you can't answer. I mean, this whole idea that, you know, we have to look a lot of stuff up. Is it called the quasi-war because there aren't troops involved? Because there are sanctions and the other kind of warlike things, right?
It was never formally declared a war.
And so because Congress did not declare it a war, they called it the quasi-war?
They were like, we better build up troops. Like we didn't really have an army, you know, so they were doing things. There was no battle. It was not a formal war, really. The French were messing with American ships at sea. And there was a bad diplomatic moment between America and France. In France.
That's the XYZ affair, right?
Ooh,
can you tell people what that is?
Yeah. So
for me, a lot of this is like you read about it in your 4th grade textbook and you know it was really important. But the XYZ affair is a really big deal.
It was a big deal. It was also America's early young nation deal. But America in this time period was just being batted back and forth between France and Britain. And they would make a treaty with one and the other one would attack. And then they would turn and make a treaty with the other and the first one would attack. So there's a treaty with Britain, the Jay Treaty, and France responds to that by messing with American ships at sea. And John Adams sends 3 diplomats to France to negotiate something and make that moment go away. And the French said, yeah, okay, we'll meet with you, but we actually want a bribe. So if you pay us the bribe, then we can meet and move ahead with this. Now, the Americans were outraged. That news came home and Americans back home were outraged. The 3 French ministers or diplomats, better word, who demanded the bribe were called in government documents Mr. X, Mr. Y, Mr. Z. So that becomes the XYZ affair. And Americans are outraged that they're being treated like a backwater nation when in fact, bribery like that was not uncommon in European courts. And the Americans were just outraged because they just didn't know per se.
Plus they didn't have any money to pay the bribes. Wasn't that part of it?
Well, they sure would not have been able. It was not only a bribe, but it was also money to help French troops. So it was even more money. It was a double whammy money issue. But at any rate, the XYZ affair becomes this huge rallying point. And that's when you get into the quasi-war with France, not declared, no actual battles, but America sort of building up in preparation for war.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So that jumped out to me because, of course, we're in another period when there's significant bribery of the president going on. That is shocking to me how little attention that's getting because the bribery and the corruption is simply off the charts.
On like a daily basis.
Yeah, for like billions with a B. But to go back to the alien and sedition stuff or the sedition stuff, it was an attempt to criminalize any criticism of the government. And just to be clear, before we get there. So people loved it and that became the law of the land and everybody was happy, right?
How did you know the story, Heather?
That's because I'm a historian. I have a PhD.
No. Okay. So, and so it's interesting. And this is part of why you and I, Heather and I were talking about this morning, because what happened is that the Federalists who have all this power, but feel that they should always have this power and aren't really, as I said before, fond of democracy per se, figure this is their moment to consolidate and clinch and it's all going to be good and then they can just stay in power forever. They push too hard. They go too far. And after the Alien and Sedition Acts, people are beginning to wonder what the heck the government is doing, right? It draws attention to the Federalists in a way that is not uniformly popular. When you get the next presidential election, this is all happening in 1798, is 2 years away. And what happens in that election ultimately is the Federalist candidates, there ends up being a tie vote because elections ran differently in those days where whoever gets the most electoral votes is president and whoever gets the second most is vice president. And in 1796, you ended up with a president from one party and a vice president from the other. In 1800, what happened was the 2 Jeffersonian Republican candidates tied. And there was a tie for 36 ballots that got thrown into the House to decide. But the Federalists are gone. The Federalists are out. And this represents a major shift in the government. The Federalists never have national power again.
So is that in part because John Quincy Adams is the son of John Adams, and there is a concern about establishing a sort of legacy family?
You mean down the road when he...
Well, just the idea that, one of the things I know that Jackson is all over in the 1830s is those Eastern, elites are establishing an aristocracy.
Oh, I see what you're saying. It's like, let's get rid of them because John Quincy Adams is John Adams' son and Adams is president and his son. There wasn't a lot of talk like that at the time. I'm sure that if Adams had won, there would have been talk like that at the time for sure. They didn't. But the thing with the Adams is the only two one-termers in that period were Adams guys because they didn't cooperate with anybody.
So, it's funny because I tend to think of John Quincy Adams as a good president, largely because of what happens later on when he goes into the House and becomes a staunch advocate of the right to petition over issues of abolition, but really over the larger principle that people have a right to ask their government to fix wrongs. But I don't know much about him as a president. Is he a good president or a bad president?
He's a perfectly fine president. He's a much more of a power force, and I think much more admirable after his presidency, when he goes to the House.
Can you tell people how he used to sign his letters?
Oh, no, this is John Adams.
Oh, John Adams signed it that way, not John Quincy.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, you should still tell people because that's one of my favorite historical tidbits from you.
It is wonderful. John Adams signed a letter to Thomas Jefferson John Adams, 89 years of age and too fat to last much longer. I'm sorry, guys. If you study the founders, that doesn't happen that often.
One of them used to be referred to as like the Great Rotundity, right?
His Rotundity, John Adams.
Rotundity. Okay, John. I thought that was his son. All right. So there's a huge backlash against the Sedition Acts and the suppression of newspapers and suppression of criticism of the president. But doesn't Thomas Jefferson use the Sedition Acts himself when he gets into power after 1801?
Ooh, you're good. So the Sedition Act lapses. It's gone. What Jefferson says is, Sedition Act, whatever, we can do this on a state level.
He's such a weenie. I'm sorry, Joanne. He also gets the presidency because he screws around at the Electoral College. That's when we get winner take all in Virginia in 1800.
Well, before we get to the Electoral College, he does say that on a state level, like, let's get some, attorneys general in states to basically call sedition. So yeah, he doesn't have an issue necessarily with the idea, but he doesn't like the national government doing it. He wants it to happen.
He wants the state governments to do it.
He wants the state governments to do it. Yeah. So we're still talking about the government and people with power trying to find ways to promote themselves and punish their enemies. The difference being that Jefferson's way is quiet and behind the scenes, and the Federalist way in the late 1790s is public and loud, and the people can see that the Federalists are pushing hard. And that's where we started, Heather, was the idea that what happened with Jimmy Kimmel, and now they're like, oh, what about all these other late night hosts? We could get them too. That's really blatantly, flamingly obvious what's going on right now. So if people weren't awake yet, which sometimes is hard to believe, but if people aren't awake yet, you can't avoid that. Right? It's kind of obvious what's happening there. And so, will there be a moment when this administration, regime, call it what you like, goes too far and people actually stand up and wake up in a way that they haven't before? What just happened this week certainly appears to have drawn people's attention in a way that we haven't seen thus far.
Well, what's interesting for me is I don't watch TV at all, just not out of principle because I don't have the time to. So I'd never seen Jimmy Kimmel. And so when all the fracas happened, I sat down and watched his monologues, about a week of his monologues. So, and you know how it is when we're reading manuscripts for somebody in a field we don't know, we call ourselves intelligent Martians, because you don't know anything about it. I was the intelligent. You've never heard that? Oh, that's what we always say. But I was like the intelligent Martian trying to figure out what this show was about and why these monologues were a problem. And it was really surprising to me because, in fact, he didn't say any of the things that were attributed to him. The thing that allegedly he says that was problematic was something to the effect of, this is not a direct quote, that MAGA Republicans were trying to pin it on everybody else, something like that. But what really jumped out in all those monologues was how critical he is of the president and of the administration, and with comedy, of course. But one of the things that did jump out is that he made a joke, and I think I'll get censored if I say it on here, but there was I think there was only one, but there was a joke about the president's anatomy and mushrooms that I know is something that tends to set off the president. And of course, the president had been calling for the removal of Jimmy Kimmel and Seth
Meyers. I don't watch this.
Seth Meyer and Jimmy Fallon, none of whom I watch. Again, not on principle, just I don't. Since July, when CBS failed to renew Stephen Colbert's license, or not his show. So it was really, again, as you're looking at it as an intelligent Martian, you're like, it's very hard to believe that the problem here was that one sentence that was actually quite accurate. They were working very hard to pin it on anybody but themselves. And it had nothing to do with the skewering of the president and the administration, which, again, if you haven't watched Kimmel, it's taking, for people who haven't seen him, it's worth watching, because, again, if you're trying to research as a Martian, there's just no doubt in your mind.
Right. Watch for yourself and see what you think. And what stands out about what you just said is that, in essence, the shooting is taking up all of the airspace, and everything is being sort of put into that box, and it's being used as a cover for all kinds of things that I was about to say the Federalists, this current administration, doesn't like, right? So in the same way that the Quasi-war became a front, so that then the Federalists could say, well, this is bad because the Quasi-war, we can crush our opponents because the Quasi-war, that some of what we're seeing right now is, this is an opportune moment. We can do a lot of things in this moment.
So, now this is a huge leap, but one of the books that was very powerful for me when I was in college was called Time of Illusion by Jonathan Schell. And it is a portrait of Nixon, President Richard Nixon, and made the point that in an era in which the United States had nuclear weapons, for the president, who had the power in that era to destroy the world, that any criticism of the president became criticism of the country, and and undermined the strength that the country needed to prevent nuclear war. And I think now that I know a lot more about Nixon and about that era, I think there's plenty of other ways to look at it. But I did think the connection between a president and a country in times of stress could tend to make somebody who did not tend to fall back on the people, somebody like Jimmy Carter, for example, think it's got to be me and nobody else, and anybody who criticizes me is out of bounds. And that's so unhealthy.
Right. It's unhealthy. It's censorship. It's suppression. It's it's sort of, when you put any political figure, but particularly a president, in that zone where that is a person who cannot be criticized, you're sort of stomping on so many fundamental political rights that we, the people, have, that, that's an incredibly difficult place to be, a bad place to be. And it makes it so that if you criticize the government, you're unpatriotic, you're a bad American. And that's the worst link of all. We all have the right to say what we want to say. We all have the right to criticize what we want to criticize. People might not like it, but that's fine. That's our right to speak out against whatever, against the government, as we choose, right? As Americans. So if someone is saying we can't do that, we can't speak our mind, and if we do speak our mind, we're somehow unpatriotic, that's just putting a muzzle. That's just silencing us in a way that is un-American.
Did you see what Tucker Carlson said? So I was fascinated by this because, of course, one of the things that has come about after the silencing of Kimmel is the recognition on the part of a lot of people who have been on the far right, recognizing that if they lose their right to speak freely, they could be in trouble too. And whether or not he was reacting to that, Tucker Carlson on his show the other day said something that fascinated me, and see if you can see why. He said that if the government can control what you can say, it is trying to control what you think. And I'm paraphrasing, by the way. And if it can control what you, if they want to control what you think, they don't consider you human, because humans have a soul and they have a right to think and to speak according to what they believe. And what jumped out to me is that is very close to what James Madison said in, was it the 1785 Remonstrance, or however the hell you pronounce that word, about religious donations, that the government cannot dictate religion because religion, like thought, is an unalienable right. And if you allow the government to establish a religion, or as Carlson says, to force you to speak in a certain way, that assaults your unalienable human rights. And I just thought it was absolutely fascinating, but maybe a reflection of that early period, that Tucker Carlson was echoing James Madison on the concept of humanity and unalienable rights.
Right. No, I think that's fascinating. First of all, I just want to say, I'm so proud that you went to James Madison. but yes, I think that, and that's, in and of itself, in that early period, the idea, that was an idea that was being fought for. Freedom of religion, that the state, the government can't enforce that on you. That's a different kind of fundamental right. That's a really powerful way of getting at this. And I did not hear that he said that. That would have woken me up in an interesting way as well.
Well, and that's actually that, and that the fact that he said that, and of course Karl Rove has come out against the administration, and John Yoo as well, who was the guy who wrote the torture memos, come out against the bombing of the ships in the Caribbean. And what increasingly, and then I was really shocked yesterday when 3 very different Democrats came out with, in the space of 24 hours, 3 very similar speeches, which reminded me of the stuff you and I talk about in the 1850s. It feels to me like people are starting to move away from that last 40 years of us versus them, which the Trump administration appears to be trying to turn into friends versus enemies, and are increasingly going for we the people versus an autocrat. And what's interesting about that to me is that when that happens, as it happened in the 1850s, the coalitions that come out of it are extremely different than the ones that went into it. And you just don't know what's going to happen. I mean, if anybody had told me that Bill Kristol would be out there leading the charge of progressivism 20 years ago, I'd have been like, that is Earth 2.0. That can't possibly happen. And yet there he is. And then you think of something like Samuel Chase.
It makes perfect sense. People that come out of that, the way that people come out of that is different from how they go in, because what we're seeing are 2 things. We're seeing the administration defining us in increasingly small and insular ways, so that there are more and more people who don't feel part of that us. They're feeling that they're somehow outside, and the people, we the people, are, becoming more engaged with what's going on. And when those 2 things happen at the same time, you have a moment where it's possible that people are, as you're suggesting here, beginning to see that us, they're not included in that us, and they don't particularly want to be included in that us. And when they speak up, and when we speak up and say, you know, whatever's going on there, they're just grabbing at power and it doesn't represent us. And look at that, it's actually savaging your rights. It's possible to push too far. It's possible to go too far. And it feels to me that that's what this administration is in the middle of doing.
What did it look like in when is the Sedition Act? 1798, 1799, 98? What did it look like? I mean, not for the people who opposed it, that seems pretty obvious, but if you were a Federalist and did you just not show up for John Adams, or did you start, I don't know, chalking graffiti of him at the base of buildings? What did one do in that period?
Well, among other things, the Federalist Party divided. They split. And so they were no longer necessarily agreeing on what was going on. It doesn't help. So you have Hamilton on one team and Adams on another team, and that's happening in this period too, so that the us is becoming smaller among the Federalists. That's part of it. The other thing that happened was Jefferson and his friends said, okay, well, we can't do things on a national level, so we're going to go to the state level and say that this is unfair. And that's where you get the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, in which Madison and Jefferson say, you know what? If something is unconstitutional, blatantly unconstitutional, we can nullify it in our state.
Yeah, well, that was stupid, but I just threw out 200 years of history right there. I'm being flippant, obviously, by saying it was stupid. It is the roots of much of where we are now. Yeah. But it does, that whole move back to the states is really interesting if you think about it.
That's what I'm saying, is sometimes federalism really matters, and this could be one of those moments as well.
We're already seeing it, you know, with the different health cooperatives on the West Coast and on the East Coast, and Pritzker up there doing what he's doing, and Michelle Lewin Grisham in New Mexico having universal child care.
Right, states standing up against ICE on a whole bunch of levels. We're watching states, and you know, the reason we have a federal system is we have a national government, we have the state governments, and they're supposed to be sort of shifting. The reason we got a constitution in the first place is because national was scary, but federal, people could deal with that. And now we're seeing some of the ways in which a federal government is really important as a check and a balance.
Can I just say, I'd really like to stop living through historic times just for a week or so.
Wouldn't boring be really, really, really nice?
You know, it's funny because I don't know about you. My happy place is history, of course. So every possible chance I get, I'm like, let's do some history, you know, and not have to look at what the latest legal decision is. I've read more legal decisions in the last 10 years than anybody who is not a lawyer or aspires to be a lawyer ought to do.
But you know, here's the thing. I'm a freaking early American historian. I thought my entire career would be spent sitting in archives looking at dead people's mail from 200 years ago.
Which was the plan.
I loved it. And then all of a sudden, here I am.
Totally. Yeah. Totally. You know? No, you think about the archives longingly, right?
Yeah. I send my students off to the archives.
But here we are, like you say, and
here
that was
thank you. Here we're going to be.
What's that?
Here we are, and here we are going to be.
Yeah, I mean, and I joke. I mean, it is wonderful in a way to watch the principles under which this country was founded come to life and make people really realize how important they are. You know, and we got to go, but you know, today we talked about government suppression of free speech, but religion's right up there, honey bunch, you know, and maybe we can do that again in the future because, you know, a lot of people are like, I'd love to see an established religion. It's like, yeah, which one?
Right. Well, exactly.
Because you think your flavor of Protestantism or whatever is going to be at the center of things, but so does your neighbor. And this is exactly why we have the separation of church and state.
Right. Like, choose a religion and be it. Although I like Honey Bunch, I'm going to tell tales out of school and say that when you sent me the link for us to start, you called it Linky Poo. You're in a mood today, Heather.
I am definitely in a mood today. There is no doubt about it. So, but you know what? You got to keep things light where you can.
You do. You definitely.
We should go. Let people get on with their daily lives.
Yes.
And thank you as always for this. I hope you have a great weekend, and it's always a pleasure.
Likewise, I get some weekend Heather time. So that if the maybe the reason isn't ideal, but the end result is pretty good.
Works for me. Love you, Joanne.
I love you too.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.